what I'd like to do is start talking about some of the key environmental laws that really started to protect air, protect water from some of the things that we were doing to our environment, some of the pollutants we were releasing into the air, the water, some of the impacts we were having on or other organisms. I'd like to outline some of those briefly, and throughout the semester as we talk about these individual topics about environmental quality, whether it's air, water, land, etc., we'll dig into them a little bit deeper. In 1963 there was the Clean Air Act. It has been amended over time, but this was the first legislation to protect our air quality. And as we'll learn a little bit later, we had a lot of issues, and some places still do, related to smog and smog events that happened that actually were deadly in our country. And it's hard to think, to actually believe that that did happen here in the United States, that our air quality was that poor. But because of the rapid industrialization, we were pumping a lot of pollutants up into the air without any types of limits on them. So in 1963, the Clean Air Act was established. It regulates air emissions from stationary and mobile sources. And what that means is that it regulates stationary factories, places where buildings that air emissions are coming from, but it also regulates air emissions from mobile sources like vehicles. There is a set of standards called the NAAQS. The NAAQS, that's the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. NAAQS, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And basically, those are standards set in order to make sure that we are keeping people healthy. So basically, scientists in the lab expose certain amounts of pollutants to organisms, and we say, okay, well, they can tolerate certain amounts, they can't tolerate certain amounts, and we come up with quality standards saying, what, this has to be brought way back. This can aggravate people's conditions. We need to keep people safe. And here in the United States, we do a pretty good job of regulating air emissions and keeping people safe, but there certainly are cities that have bigger challenges. And we'll talk about why that's the case. Why, for example, Los Angeles has major smog issues and air quality issues, and our other big cities may not have those same types of challenges because of the topography, their location, their climate, etc. When we talk about 1964, we think of the Wilderness Act, and that was really a wilderness preservation system, setting aside over 110 million acres of land as wilderness. Again, more of this conservation effort as opposed to scaling back pollution. This was really just setting aside land as wilderness to not be developed, to try to limit our human impact on it. In 1965, a couple different things occurred, a couple different laws went into effect. The Federal Water Pollution Control Act, preventing pollution from going into waterways like rivers and streams. We'll also talk about the Clean Water Act a little bit later. That also relates to that as well. In addition, in 1965, there was the Solid Waste Disposal Act, and today we call it RCRA, or RCRA. We call it RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And again, these things have morphed and changed as they've needed to over time. The Solid Waste Disposal Act, or RCRA, handles solid waste. So it seems strange for us to even think about our garbage being dumped into the ocean, or our garbage being left around on land or thrown into the forest, or our garbage being burned, without any kind of regulation. The Solid Waste Disposal Act really took over responsibility for regulating solid waste. Okay, how are we handling that? How are we landfilling it? How are we handling hazardous waste? And that was really something that had to be done. All right, that can play into certainly air pollution concerns if we're incinerating garbage, but also our water, our land pollution, because of garbage. We can't just dispose of it however we feel like. Okay, not only can it be hazardous to our environment, but it can negatively impact us, okay, by spreading disease and polluting our water, etc. So it needed to be regulated, and today it's regulated under what we call RCRA, or the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, previously called the Solid Waste Disposal Act. Okay, in 1968, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was enacted, and that really regulated hunting and fishing. We know that we in Michigan certainly have a permit system. In order to fish, hunt, you need a license. And some people think that's too expensive, and we could get into that conversation. But the idea is that we want to kind of control how many organisms we're taking out of our environment. In the past, unfortunately, we've overexploited certain species that we use for food, for example, like our fish. And we have to make sure that we regulate it in a way that people can eat, but at the same time that so much is not taken by individuals that populations of fish, for example, cannot repopulate. So that's really important that we have those protections in place for our species, to not only protect them, they are a viable part of their food web, but also so they're there for the long term for our use as well. As we turn into to 1970, 1970s was a really big turning point in U.S. environmental policy. In 1970, the first Earth Day happened. Okay, the first Earth Day in 1970. We call this time period of the 1970s the modern environmental movement. And that's kind of what, when you talk about environmental law or you bring it up to somebody, typically we think of the 1970s as being, you think about when we first started doing anything regarding environmental science here in the United States. A couple different things happened at that time. The establishment of the EPA, which is our Environmental Protection Agency, happened. That is a big deal. We'll talk about EPA and the regulations that come out of that part of our government. The first Earth Day, like I said, and what we called NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, was a very important act that was established in 1970. The NEPA requires that something called an EIS is prepared for projects to study what impact they'll have on the environment. An EIS, that's an environmental impact statement. So when projects are proposed, if a Costco is going in, or some kind of factory is being built, an incinerator, housing developments, construction, the NEPA requires that companies or the government, whoever is going to be doing this type of construction, for example, doing some kind of project, prepares what we call an EIS, or an environmental impact statement. And that basically has to study what impacts that project is going to have on the environment. From water, from a soil, from any kind of potential contamination. The project has to be done properly to protect certain species. There's certain projects that get rejected because they could negatively impact species that are there. So the NEPA was a big deal, and it was right at that beginning of what we call the modern environmental movement, to really look at individual things that we're doing, projects that we're taking on, and before they're even approved, deciding, is this going to be have too negative of an impact on the environment? Should we do it or should we not? And that's what the NEPA does. It really requires that EIS to be prepared prior to us having some kind of negative impact. All right, in 1972, the Marine Mammal Protection Act was enacted to address concerns about population decreases of our marine mammals, to prevent overfishing, overharvesting, the killing of whales, etc. All of those organisms are protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Not all countries around the world have the same protections. Whaling is allowed in some other countries. So it's not, across the board. It's really just U.S. policy here that we want to protect those animals that we have in our oceans and make sure that their populations are protected. All right, we know now how important ecosystems are in terms of balance and numbers, and those larger animals are really critical parts of their food web. So we have to be careful about what we do, and in 1972 that protection was put into place. Also in 1972 the Federal Pesticide Act was enacted, and we discussed in 1962 Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the book that really kind of ignited this topic about pesticides. Keep in mind that pesticides are toxins, okay? They are meant to kill a pest. And, Rachel Carson brought to light this kind of impact, like, for example, DDT, and how it bioaccumulates and biomagnifies in food webs and has negative impacts, to a lot of different species. Sometimes you'll see on pesticide labels, a broad spectrum pesticide. That means that it does affect a lot of different species. So we have to be careful when we're applying these types of chemicals that we're targeting what we want to be targeting and not having a negative impact on other species of organisms. For example, we know in recent years we've had issues with populations of honeybees declining, and we know how important they are for pollination, and farmers depend on them. So scientists are now looking into, why are these populations decreasing at such a fast rate? Is it some kind of pesticide or some kind of chemical we're putting out into the environment that is causing a steep decline in the honeybee population? So the Federal Pesticide Act of 1972 was put into place, obviously, to control pesticides, the sale, distribution, and application of those chemicals. So if you do see a chemical bottle, a pesticide bottle, you will see a lot of information that is provided to the user of that pesticide. There is a lot of information that is required by the Federal Pesticide Act to be on that label, to educate the person that's using it about the impacts, the intended use of them, etc. In 1973, the Endangered Species Act, many of us have heard of. It was put into place to conserve threatened and endangered plants and animals. We typically think of, the giant panda, some of our endangered tigers, but there are thousands of species that are on one of our endangered species lists, whether they're critically endangered, they're threatened, etc. When we think about the importance, like I said before when we talked about the Marine Mammal Protection Act, all species have value in their own ecosystems. They're there for a reason. So when we identify a species we look at kind of the numbers and we try to do counts of them. If we see that they're declining rapidly, we want to know what's happening. Is it something that's happening naturally? Is it something that we are impacting and we can change? Okay, as they approach this critical number we'll talk about later, then they become endangered, and the concern is that they're going to become extinct. And if we feel like we're causing that, we will be required to act. Okay, and that could mean that we're going to breed them in captivity. That means that, or it could just mean that we're protecting that area that they live in if we were having some kind of negative impact on them before. We will talk about them in this act in more detail later when we talk about our ecosystems. Okay, in 1974, the Safe Water Drinking Act was enacted. And that was really to regulate the public drinking water supply. So when we think about where our water comes from for drinking, it typically either comes from a well at our home or it comes from the public water supply. It just depends on where your home is and whether you have well water or you have public drinking water. So both of those things are regulated. If you purchase your home or sell your home, at that time the water is tested for contamination, for any kind of problems that would make it unsafe. And the government's establishing what's safe water, what is safe potable water, what is safe for us to drink. So if it does not fall into those limits, then you might have to drill a new well, or you might have to purify your water. There's a lot of different things that can be done if it doesn't fall into those permitted allowable amounts. When we think about public water, drinking water supply, it is extremely regulated. All right, when we think about having water come into our house from our town, it is tested constantly to make sure it is safe for us to drink. So we don't really have to, we still test that water, when houses are, sold, etc. But the concerns are not the same as if you have an individual well. When the public is at risk for their drinking water, if there's concerns about contamination, the public must be alerted under the Safe Water Drinking Act. So, for example, in Edwardsburg last year, when the horrible horse farm fire happened, there was a boil order. Okay, when there is extreme flooding, for example, sometimes the town goes on what we call a boil order. And that means that the water is not safe for drinking. So it is recommended that you either boil your water before you consume it, or you can obviously just decide to use bottled water, or not. You cannot consume the water directly from your tap. If you want to consume water from your tap, then you must boil it first. And that's basically because it's tested constantly and something has happened that has compromised the safety of that drinking water. So it is highly regulated to keep us safe. And it's necessary because, sometimes it happens where it's not, okay, where there's been some kind of over-release of, for example, water from a sewage treatment plant that hasn't fully been removed, all the toxins haven't been removed from it, all of the unsafe materials in it haven't been removed. There's some kind of discharge that's unsafe, and the public must be alerted, okay, to that concern for their safety, okay, and the federal government regulates that to keep us safe.